You're listening to Power Athlete Radio, a podcast dedicated to empowering your performance every damn day. Join former NFL pro and Power Athlete founder John Welborn as he dissects the greatest minds in strength, conditioning, and more. So whether your goal is to be the hammer, destroy mediocrity, or simply move the dirt, you've come to the right place. Now with the warm-up done, let the gains begin.
Today we were trying to get some quotes for new health insurance. Obviously, health insurance is like a massive thing for type 1 diabetes, trying to get these plans, and it's so predatory is the only word I can think of. Like, I don't really use health insurance. Like, I get my blood work done, but I use a service. Like, I don't really get sick. Like, I don't really have I wouldn't even need health insurance. I've never really, and so like this stuff, Kate had cancer twice, and then Cash has got the type 1, and now Achilles sprained her ankle, and so it's just like this between Kate and Cash, it's the exorbitant costs of type 1 are just insane.
Well, I actually did a cost calculation. So when I transitioned jobs not too long ago, I went without health insurance for a period of time. I was doing the cost calculation, and it would have cost me like $6,000 a year, 6 to 7, for me to do my standard stuff without health insurance, because the out-of-pocket costs are so much cheaper. The second I got insurance, and then I'm paying all the co-pays, it would have jumped almost instantly to $16,000 to $18,000 minimum for just me, and that doesn't account for all the expenses that would accrue for my family just to have it. Right, because they're not going to really use it that much. My kids, yes, because they're going through, depending on how sick they get that year, they might go to more pediatric visits.
So wait a minute, rewind this. So you had no health insurance, and your out of pocket was probably around $6,000, and then once you got insurance, the cost was probably like $18,000. So it was almost
it nearly tripled. And I've calculated this many times, because just to have the insurance alone costs way more than it costs to manage diabetes, depending on how you do it, right? So if you're using these devices, they get very expensive. But let's say the cost is even lower if you do it with injections. So let's say you just do pure injections, you don't have all the fancy pods and other things like that. The number gets lower, especially if I were to go use regular insulin, because I obviously do the lower carbohydrate based approach. I could get that down to $4 a year, because keep in mind, when you do out-of-pocket expenses for things like Dexcom, otherwise you can get deals. So you can actually get deals. It costs less. Whereas if you were to pay, if you do it with insurance, by default, to just have the insurance alone costs more than it costs me to actually pay out of pocket for everything.
Wow. Yeah. No,
so it's really a bankruptcy. It's more of if you get something so life-threatening, will you go bankrupt? And so, for example, my son's risk for type 1 diabetes is 1 in 14, whereas someone without type 1 diabetes in their family history, it's 1 in 300. So if he were to get it and he were to go to the hospital for any significant period of time, that's at least $100,000 medical bill. And that would have crazy impact on, $100,000. I don't care who you, there are some people that's insignificant, but that's meaningful. And so that's obviously, you can avoid costs like that. It's very helpful, but you're still going to fight for it. You're still I remember when I went to the hospital, and I had one of the best health insurances in the United States of America. It was called Capital Health Plan in Tallahassee, Florida, and they paid for everything. I almost paid nothing. At least my parents at the time paid almost nothing for any of my diabetes care. It was all free. Wow. It was all 100% covered. And then I got diabetes preceding that, out of state. I was in the ICU for 7 days, and I was in the hospital for 2 weeks total. And I forgot what the bill was, but I know it was over 6 digits or 6 figures.
Yeah, that was ours.
Yeah, and it fought down to, I think, 1,000 out of pocket or something insanely low. But yeah, nowadays that cost would be way higher. It's a different world we live in.
We interrupt this episode with a shameless self-promotion. Are you struggling to balance life and training? Let me introduce you to Grindstone. Punch the clock in the face with our most flexible training program designed to fit around external stresses. Perfect for the boardroom warriors, parents, students, and athletes looking to train while life has your axe to the grindstone. Claim a 7-day free trial by heading to powerathletehq.com/grindstone today. Now, back to the show. No, and it's egregious. Like I mean, we're the only country in the world that has this issue. And even we lived in California, it was much better because there was a lot of regulatory things where they just couldn't overcharge. In Texas being more conservative, it's just much more egregious. So yeah, we were going through all this stuff. And I told her, I was like, why don't we just do 2 separate plans? Why don't we just put you and Cash on one and then put me and the kids on the other and just give me the most basic one on the planet.
That's actually really smart considering, because there's the single, the double, and then there's the family. Yeah. So, I mean, for me and the kids, like, I mean, other than, I think my one daughter, goes to counseling. So like that was on it, but like that's out of pocket. And so like, I'm looking at this stuff and I'm like, the only thing I really do is, I like Doc Parsley's my, I guess performance doc, you would say. And, the stuff that he gives me is like DHEA and this, and like, he can do it from like a compounding pharmacy and some of the things he sends me, but I can also buy that stuff from like Thorne and some of the other places. So, other than that, I ended up going up and getting my knee looked at, like I have a kind of an interesting deal in that, which actually takes me back to jiu-jitsu. I went to go see this orthopedic surgeon. I'm like, hey, I know I have some bony arthritic changes in my knee from the injuries and the surgeries, but like I can't get my heel to my butt, and it's really causing problems with my jiu-jitsu, and I want to be better. So they put me through the x-rays and the MRIs, and he came back and he was just like shaking his head, and he's like, first of all, I can't believe you don't have any pain, and I'll text you the x-ray, you'll laugh. And he's like, most people that have this issue would be looking at like a total knee replacement. And he goes, the fact that you don't have pain and you're just telling me you want to be better at jits because you can't get your heel to your butt, and like it makes it really hard to like play knee shields and try to hook the bottom leg. And I keep getting like leaving it out there and getting into coyote guard and just like all these things. And I'm like, man, it's really making my game really one dimensional because I have to like play left leg up, and I have to constantly especially when I'm playing guard play, I'm just playing off of my right side the whole time. So the doctor looked at me and he's like, dude, he's like, this is gnarly. So I got these huge osteophytes on the back that are acting like doorstops. And then I got this huge horn underneath my kneecap. And so all of these are contributing to just, basically locking my knee at 90. So he goes, we get 2 options. We can either cut it all out and do a knee replacement. And he's like, but I don't do that. Or you let me open it up and I'll chisel all that stuff off. So I kind of asked him, like, what do you think? And he's like, well, since you don't have pain and you have pretty good muscle function, and he goes, and you still want to train at a high level, he's like, why don't we just clean it out? And he goes, if it doesn't work in a couple of years, then you get a knee replacement. But he goes, if we go the knee replacement now, it's really the only option we have going forward. So that was cool. So yeah, I was. Are you planning to compete, John?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to. I would love to compete, and I would love to train more. It's just, pretty much if I could train 5-6 days a week, I'd be pretty excited. I was training pretty consistent, and then I my knee was feeling really banged up. So I was like, you know what? Let me take like a couple like weeks, which turned into a couple months. I took out like 2 months off just to kind of see like maybe I can get this thing to calm down. Maybe it'll feel better, and then it didn't. So I was kind of like, So I went back and I started training again, and then I was like, man, let me book an appointment and let somebody look at this thing. And then the guy looked at it, and he's like, there's no amount of rehab or therapy or injections or anything that you have for us to fix this. And then he said, I have a weird genetic condition where my bones are extremely dense and fractures heal real fast. Like what would take people, weeks to heal, take me days. And that's been like that my whole life. Like, break a finger, break a toe, fracture something. And like the doctor, they'd x-ray it, and like 3 days later it'd be healed. So he said that from that effect, I'm getting a super healing effect, but the way that the body's doing it is just laying down bone in that joint. And then he x-rayed all my other joints. And he goes, but you only have it in your knee, which means that it's like from a surgical intervention. So, or the fact.
Well, John, let me just say this, like, even if you were to compete at only be able to go 90 degrees with your strength, depending on if you do like an open versus a masters, with your strength, if you were to go actually at your belt, actually at your weight, and actually at your age division, your strength is so crazy that if you have good fundamentals, even if you can't bend your knee all the way, you're going to do pretty good.
Yeah.
Like, I know that pretty good is not your forte. But,
no. Well, I mean, also, since you've been doing jits, most of the guys that fit within my belt age bracket and kind of weight class actually look horrendous. You know, if you're like,
oh yes,
if so I'm a 2-stripe blue belt, and if I'd shown up to promotion, I'd probably have more stripes, and maybe, I don't know. I'm definitely not a purple belt, but the blue belts that are, you know, I'm like a Masters 4 Ultra. Like I like, because I've been to a few deals, and I look at these guys and I'm like, holy shit, dude, these dudes might as well look like they're 100 years old. And
well, let me tell you this. That's true. It's very true. Well, because like the old mantra, like so at the last tournament I was just at in Atlanta, all the guys I competed against, they would say, look, I've never competed with someone as strong as you before, because most of the guys in the ultra division, they're probably not doing anything but jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
And they're so used to being the biggest guy in the gym, they don't need to strength train. They're already stronger than everyone.
Sure.
And so having any level of athleticism at that upper weight class. Now, if you're in like an open bracket at a higher belt, oh, those dudes, like that's terrifying.
Yeah.
But
those are the guys I train with. You know, I train.
I know.
I train with the top ultras in the world, you know, like Victor Hugo and those guys. And it's absolutely frightening. Like I try to explain to people, I'm like, when you can have like a 16 or 18-year-old Brazilian kid come in and like, you know, basically pressure check your jiu-jitsu. That's actually my joke for people. I'm like, if you want to pressure check your jiu-jitsu, go have like a 16 or 18-year-old kid from Brazil who's been racing or rolling since he's like 3 or 4, show up and absolutely smash you. I mean, Philippe had a couple kids from his hometown come visit. These kids were like, you know, 16, 18, probably like 190, 200 pounds.
Yeah.
They come train at the gym and they're super nice, and we go out and roll with them. And I was like I was having to use every bit of fundamental and like strength and anything I had to not get absolutely murdered by these kids. And so, and then they went and then they went into our classes and were like wrecking people's lives. And I'm like, yeah, these kids they train 3 times a day. It's such a high watermark.
And it's their whole lifestyle. Yeah. Like it's like it's their whole lifestyle. It's what they think about. Honestly, it's to the point. It's such, as you know, it's such a addicting sport to get engaged in, because it's like so functionally relevant in everyday life too. Like so it's cool. Like as you get better, like it actually matters. Like not that you're going to go get into a bar fight or anything crazy for the rest of your life, but not only is it relevant to real life, but also you can then go compete in there's so many opportunities to compete as far as, you know, IBJJF. There's, I don't know if this is a regional or not. There's Fuji, there's Newbury. There's all of these different American Grappling Federation. Like there's all these different opportunities to compete in there, all this ADCC as well. But once you like, man, I'll just say this. When I first competed, I was addicted. It was addicting. And then when I went and competed in IBJJF, because the one I did before was smaller, like more regional, IBJJF was Atlanta, and so was everyone from the Southeast region coming in there, and some people from outside of there coming in for their open championship. And that was really cool to be a part of that. That was a very, very, honestly, I left there and I was like, I watched some of the videos and like the mistakes, and like I just want to go right back in there. I was like, I shouldn't have done that, and I shouldn't have done this. And if I would have warmed up better doing this, and this, I would have been like lightning, you know, because like I made some stupid mistakes, man. Like I went around and got someone's back, and I already got someone down, and then they got back up, which I was really impressed with, because I sprawled all the way on their back, and I'm like 230. I'm not 300 pounds or anything. Like one of the guys I was competing against was getting close to that. But I sprawled out, and he was still able to get back up. I'm like, that's pretty impressive, actually.
Dude, if you're an adult masters, because I assume you were like Masters 1.
Yeah. Masters 2, actually.
Yeah, Masters 2.
I'm getting older now.
I know. Like for the most part, like in like when I meet guys that are bigger, they're, you know, like it's not like they're like a big jack 300 pounds. It's like, or 270 or 260. And like I've had guys that are big dudes, and they come in and like, man, I need to lose weight, and I'm like, I don't know if I would use jiu-jitsu as my method to try to lose weight, but like maybe there's like hey, to be better at jiu-jitsu. But the biggest thing that I've found, especially for guys over the age of 30, it's trunk flexibility. So their ability to be transverse and rotation. So like my classic move, you get on top, I go to like stack pass people. So what I'll do is I'll put a leg over the top, and then I take the other hand and I basically hold it, and then I try to staple their leg to the ground, and they don't have any external rotation in their hips because they're usually so tight. And I get people to tap on
Where are
that.
you? So you're saying you're underhooking.
Yeah. So I'll underhook on this side. Like if I'm playing top, I'll basically underhook and kind of almost like fake, let them get me in a triangle. And then what I'll do is I'll grab the leg, put it on my shoulder, get weight on top, and then I take the other hand and I staple their leg down like their knee, and then I just basically just taco them up. And most guys.
Wait, how much do you weigh now, John?
I'm rated at like 268.
Oh my God, with your strength, that'd be absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, and
do that.
And so what we'll do is we call it a stack pass, but basically what I'll do is I'll reach over and I just grab the gi or their neck, however it is, staple the leg, and then I just kind of like imagine like you're trying to like break a wishbone, and I'll kind of like lean here and push away. And like most people don't have that form of external rotation within their hips, and then they don't have trunk rotation, and they're usually very stiff in their trunk because they haven't been doing athletic movements. And like, especially if their hips are a little arthritic or they don't train, whatever, and like the look of fear in their eyes, and we just let them cook. And I've had dudes tap all the time from
too. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. It's good. But what's good for me is, I've been in that position on the bottom side before. And because I'm flexible and because I have good transverse rotation and good hip mobility and all those things, I'm able to just kind of like, I'm fine. I'm good here. And then normally they'll just try to pass it. But, I train with some really good dudes, and I think like that's the interesting thing when you go somewhere else or new people come in and you're like, oh shit, yeah, no, I guess I'm not. I guess my jiu-jitsu isn't as shitty as I thought it was.
That's one thing that because a lot of the guys I train with, there's a few black belts in the gym, smaller gym though, and it's in Tallahassee, so it's a smaller area in general. But when you actually get someone at a similar size and get to and they actually give you a real go, it's a really special experience because you're in a gym where that's possible every day, but in not many gyms that's not. Like actually all the guys I went up against this past tournament, let me put it this way. I was the strongest guy they had ever competed with in jiu-jitsu, period. And I'm pretty strong. I'm 230. I'm not.
You're a pretty strong fucking dude, man. I mean, I'm going to use a little.
I'm nowhere near your strength.
I'm going to use a little bit of profanity just to put the emphasis on it. But dude, I peep on your Instagram. I mean, dude, you're doing Hatfield squats with 500, 540 for reps. I mean, hitting good depth. I mean, that dude, you're a strong dude. Well,
I'm not your level. I'm definitely nowhere close to what you're doing. And I actually started to cut back a little bit on that because I wanted to cut back and get my cardio. My cardio is good. Like it's better than probably anyone in the ultra class that we were competing against. But I feel like I needed to put myself in more uncomfortable positions for 5-minute increments just to get into the suck cave a little bit more, so that when and I felt really good. Like I felt really good at the tournament, but still the adrenaline hit, and I was like, why do I feel like this? Like I don't think I should be feeling like this right now, but I feel
that adrenaline drop of just like.
No, I kind of did feel that way, and I was like, "Are you serious? Like I'm not out of shape like this." And because when I flipped over like an idiot, he like looked around like holy shit and just plopped right on me. That belly just right in my face, and I'm like, "Oh Jesus, here we go." I got back up, I got on top, and I got into a submissive position, time right now, but still, I would hope to avoid that again.
What are you doing for your cardio? Like just shark tanks?
Yeah. So what I have, well, actually, I was doing Aerodyne based continual movements. Then I flipped over to I would lift. Then at the end of a lifting session, so what I would do is I would hit a very powerful compound movement, like say a Hatfield, or I very rarely do deadlifts, but I will do them once in a while, once a week at partial movements, because I don't need to take them off the floor. I just need to keep myself strong. At least that's my goal.
Yeah.
And so I'll hit something like that for the initial, and I'll do reps with them. So I'll go up to the top weight, I'll do reps with it, or maybe I'll back off after doing an initial heavier set just to get primed at that weight and hit volume. Then after that, I'm doing more of accessory movements that are relevant to what I would experience in a jiu-jitsu setting, but I want to build functional strength. Let's say I do a front squat oriented movement with a safety squat bar, like up in my chin. Like there's just really nice ways of doing that. It's really stable. And I'll do front leg lunges with those, but I'll try and do them with a little bit more speed. I'm not trying to go either way. So I'm trying to make, I'll cut back, and then I'll cut the time back a little bit on the intervals on those. Then at the end, for certain segments of the week, is I would actually do like jump ropes. So let's say I'll do like 250 double legs. Then I'll do back and forth. So like scissor kicks, and then I'll do up, down, or like high knees, and then I'll repeat that cycle. And basically I'd go 10 minutes straight with something like that. But the problem is that because other things popped up in life, like when I would go, my strength was so good that it was such an asset that I'm like, okay, if I don't have enough time to do everything in the gym today, then I'm probably just going to cut out this jump roping today. And so leading into the tournament, I had to cut more of that out, and because I was so low on time. And either way, so I wasn't able to keep it super consistent. So my goal is to have that a more of a stable, because before I was doing every third day, I was on an Airdyne bike going 30 minutes minimum, and I was trying to crank pretty hard. Like I was at one point sustaining, over 13 miles on these Echo Rogue bikes over, so which would have been an average around 350 to 400 watts for 30 minutes straight.
Jesus.
And but I was able to, I never started there. So I was able to get up to that point.
400 watts is roughly 50, no, what is it? It's 400 watts. If you hold 400 watts for 2 minutes is kind of like one of our little bit of benchmarks. Like we'll do like a 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off. And you try to hold that 400 watts, but to be able to hold close to 400 watts for 30 minutes, like, cause I mean, that's 40 calories a minute, I think is what it works out to be. 400 watts is 40 calories a minute.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was, the time it rakes out to like up per mile time. It was like,
do you remember how many total calories it is? Cause I only measure calories and watts is what we kind of measure for the Echo bike.
I would have to go back. I took a picture of it.
It'd be 1,200 calories. Like, it'd be 1,200 calories.
It was hard. It was definitely hard. I would say that, but I worked up to it. What I found is that it was more of the mentality. Like I was doing, because I always look at it from a mile time. So I was always try to, at a minimum, do at least 0.4 miles every 60 seconds. And so, like I know for the NHL, those guys, when they do their testing, they need to hit 0.5 over a 60-second window. So what I would try to do is I would try to maintain at least 0.4 plus. And so in this case, I think I was more like 0.46 the entire time, for every minute on minute. And then at the very end, I would just view it as like, I'm going to sprint the last minute no matter what, and try to give it everything I had and see how long I can maintain, like 500 or so watts at the very, very tail end, maybe 600. But again, that's what I used to do every third day, but I cut that out because the volume of jiu-jitsu I started doing, because I go 6 days a week, and sometimes more than once a day. And it's actually like 2-minute walk from my house.
Nice.
So that's a huge factor. So I have a home gym and it's 2 minutes walk from the house. And that's kind of game changing. So that makes it super consistent and makes it so that I can just like, oh, I went this morning at 6 a.m. and I can go today at 11. So I'm going to go today at 11.
So Shanji's place is about a 45, 50-minute drive for me to go. And then Victor's place is probably, even though it's 5.9 miles, I have to get through Lakeway. So it can be anywhere from like 25 to 45 minutes. And then to go to Shanji's is just like another 15 minutes past that. So they're actually opening up a third location that'll be probably less than 800 meters from my house.
Oh,
it's going to be great. Yeah, I'm pretty excited about that, because then I'll be able to be like, I got some free time. I'll be back in an hour, and then I'll be able to go roll and train.
It's such a game changer to have that. The time factor has, honestly, my wife's the one who pushed me to get a home gym in the first place, because I was trying to get deals on Marketplace and all these other things. She's like, just buy the damn equipment. So I bought it, and it's changed my entire life. The consistency, that's what a lot of the guys in the gym that I train with, like, well, like, what do you do? I'm like, I just set it up to where it's hard not to do it.
Yeah.
Like I make it to where, like, I set it up to where I do the weightlifting right before I go to jiu-jitsu, because all that priming makes me a lot more injury proof too, because I'm so much used to lifting heavier things, and I'm warmed up already, and I'm not going to want to lift after jiu-jitsu. Like usually I don't. Yeah. And so I try to do it before. Now, when I got closer to the tournament, I actually flipped it. I prioritized the jiu-jitsu, and then I would just come home and be like, I have to do this. And I did it. But it wasn't, and sometimes I wouldn't because of work, and then I would do it later in the day, and then I was doing 2-a-days, and I could always succeed with a single bout of exercise that is continuous and just get it all done at once. And if I start splitting it up over multiple bouts, it just seems like it wears me down more when I split it up. Even though I perform better in each individual bout, the totality of its impact on me just makes it harder to recover. So I feel it more. Let me put it that way.
How does the type 1 diabetes play into it? Because I know for Cash, he'll tend to bonk. Like he always, blood sugar always drops. Like I'll make sure as we're going in, I'll always kind of hit him with like, one of the glucose tabs, make sure he's a little bit higher, like, right around 115, 120. And he'll get done with the warm up and like, like the classes are usually 55 minutes and we're like 15, 25 minutes in, and I'll see it start kind of creeping down.
Yep.
And then as soon as it gets to the water break, he comes over and I can see it in his face and I give him another glucose tab, but it takes a few minutes to hit. So I'm like, hey, dude, just sit down and relax. And I wonder if that's just the age where, when you're a little bit older, you're a little bit smarter with it.
Well, the approach I take completely depends on, as you know, as a dad of someone with type 1 diabetes, it depends on a multitude of factors. But what I do now currently is, because I'm using one of these automatic insulin delivery systems, there's always an infusion of insulin. But that computer system is making decisions for me. I'm better at making the decisions than the computer system is in those moments. So what I'll do is, I know leading into going to jiu-jitsu, I already know, like the morning classes Tuesday, Thursday are wrestling based. So I already know there's no way my heart rate's not going to be high. The intensity is not going to be low. The chance of that is 0. And so I know I'm going to go in there and it's going to go low if I don't do anything. So what I do is I suspend all the insulin 30 minutes out. Now, if I have coffee, then I'll have a little bit of extra fat with it, because fat won't spike my blood sugar, but it will make the insulin on board less powerful if the fat is sufficiently high in volume. So I'll do that leading into it. Now, what's going to happen with my blood sugar is it starts at, like, let's say 100. I suspend it and may creep up a hair when we start. It will continue to creep up until that moment hits in the jiu-jitsu class, where it's like 15 to 30 minutes in, where the intensity is high enough for long enough where all that starts to come back down. But when it comes back down, I've suspended the insulin for long enough to where my insulin on board, or the total amount of insulin in my system, is now below a critical threshold. The threshold for me is around 1.5 to 1 total insulin units on board, to where if I'm below that level, no matter how much activity I do, John, I will not go low, no matter what, because no matter what. And I found that consistently. So if I wake up, John, and I do like a 11 o'clock class, and I go walk all morning on a treadmill, like I have one behind me, I'll get my insulin so low before the class that it doesn't matter what happens, my blood sugar is going to stay flat as an arrow. If I don't eat anything. And I prefer to go into these.
Is that from the non-media glucose uptake? The fact that like it's blocking? Am I saying that right?
No.
Yeah.
So that is a phenomenon, but that phenomenon doesn't kick into usually 60 plus minutes post exercise. So most classes in jiu-jitsu, unless you're in a studio that does like drilling and then jiu-jitsu afterwards, and it's 2 hours. So it depends on the style of class you're going into.
Sure.
I find that when I go into these classes, because they're 60 minutes in duration, I'll typically lift beforehand. So I will suspend the insulin before I go lift. Lifting doesn't have as much of an impact unless I'm trying to make it very quick. And so let's say the total time is an hour and a half. I will suspend 15 minutes before I lift. That lifting will kind of help offset any of the glucose changes too much. But then by the time I get into the class itself, I've already had 45 minutes of no insulin being administered. So the total amount of insulin on board, because insulin acts over a 2-hour window, these bolus-based insulins, you're going to now bring that below the original threshold. And what does that mean for most people? Let's say that most people, if they have one of these AID systems on their phone, automatic insulin delivery systems, if they look at the amount of IOB, insulin on board, when they wake up in the morning, that's usually the basal amount of insulin required to keep their blood sugar flat. And so for me, that number is 2. 2 insulin units on board is the number required to keep me flat just waking up. So what I have found is at that level, I can do walks, other things, weightlifting, nothing will change. No big deal, assuming there's no food on board, by the way. But if I go do something high intensity, where typically blood sugars will drop with it, and I don't mean so high intensity will spike. I mean high enough and hard enough, but not like sprint, full max effort type things. Then it will go down, but it won't go down if the insulin on board is sufficiently low. Because the only way for your blood sugar to drop within a 60-minute period is from insulin bringing it down. And if your insulin is sufficiently low, it will not go down. Now, this is there's a whole nother phenomenon, John, of, 2 hours after exercise, or for some people it happens earlier, but there's the insulin independent glucose uptake through a GLUT4 translocation. You have to have sufficiently hard exercise for long enough, but that effect is actually over 60 minutes afterwards. So a lot of times when people are going through exercise and they're like, why is my blood sugar tank all the time? And they try all these different things. There's two major factors. Well, there's many factors involved. Okay, but I'm going to simplify it to the ones that I think are most relevant to people. If you remove all these other variables, is the total amount of insulin on board is the biggest predictor of what's going to happen to your blood sugar when you get in there. And if the insulin on board is too high, you're going to have some type of glucose input to offset the drop.
Sure.
So that means you have to have food input. That means that you do protein has a very subtle and sustained elevation, which can be very successful for a lot of people if they don't want to load carbs. For some people, they will require carbohydrates depending on if they get too close to exercise and the insulin's too high. Then you need something that's going to act fast enough. And so those are the typical strategies. I used to always focus on food beforehand, but I actually found that for people, even elite athletes, some of which I've coached before, that go into these bouts and think, oh, I need to have this specific meal before. What I have found is that in type 1 diabetes, food introduces more problems reliably than solutions. And so a lot of times when athletes go into, let's say, a performance bout, the focus, like myself included, the focus is how do I make sure that 80% of the time I have a reliable result, and then 20% of the time you might have some random outcome. But I want the reliability. And then I focus on the nutrition outside of that window, because what's more reliable to impair performance in type 1 diabetes? High and variable blood sugars or blood sugars coming down. That will reliably impair performance. Whereas if you were to go into exercise and say, well, if I have this nutrition with insulin going into it, then I'm going to have this optimal training outcome because that's what the studies showed. I'm saying, well, yeah, that's true. But with type 1 diabetes, the likelihood that you injecting insulin right before you go into exercise is going to end exactly how you hope it is much less likely with more insulin on board than less insulin on board, because there's all these variables, like around 40 different variables, John, that affect insulin sensitivity.
Yeah.
And that day, maybe you slept less.
Yeah.
Maybe you walked outside early in the morning. You don't normally do that. Like all these things are going to interact to you having a unique metabolic status in that moment. The more insulin you have on board, the more that insulin will be magnified in its impact on glucose levels. So the less on board, the less magnifying effect. So typically around activity, I try to keep my insulin low, and then I basically fuel outside of that when the risk is so much lower, if that makes sense.
So what do you, I mean, I assume you're not fasting in the training.
Oh, I do.
Oh.
Yep. Yeah. So I actually wake up and I'm not recommending anyone else do this.
Yeah.
Everyone's got to do it their own way.
Sure.
But what I do is I actually wake up, I'll have coffee, I'll work, and then I'll go into a training session with basically nothing on board and I'll suspend my insulin 30 minutes prior, and it's like a flat line. It's brilliant. I love it. And I don't have to worry about anything, because the second I introduce food and insulin, I reliably, feel less alert. So the more insulin on board, it's kind of like has a sedative effect on the brain. And so I feel less alert. I feel less engaged. Or if I were to have food, John, I would just try to split it far enough in advance to where by the time we get to exercise, a lot of the insulin that was injected doesn't linger around. One of the biggest problems in type 1 diabetes is you have the insulins we inject last for 2 to 3 hours. Whereas, John, your pancreas, if you were to go eat a donut right now, is going to release insulin within seconds to minutes.
Sure.
And it will all be out of your system within the 30 minutes to 60 minutes. Whereas me, or anyone with type 1 diabetes, the fastest insulins you can inject are going to last 2 to 3 hours. Yeah. And so by default, you always have more in your system than you necessarily want, and is obviously not necessarily matching normal physiology. And so that's really how people have to manage and play the game when it comes to type 1 diabetes, is around thinking ahead 2 hours in advance, because that's how long insulin lingers. Mm-hmm. There are some faster forms of insulin, like Afrezza, where you can actually inhale it. And it does get in quicker and get out quicker, but usually it's cost prohibitive for most people, and many doctors are apprehensive to administer it. And the minimum dose you can administer is 4 total units. And so there's a lot of limitations around it, but it's a lot quicker. So either way, most people are stuck with injectable insulins.
Sure.
And I go on and on and on about that. And it just suffices to say, when it comes to managing around something like diabetes, going into an exercise bout, I choose reliability and consistency over, oh, this one time if I do it, I might get this rock star performance, but 80% of the time I'm going to have variable outcomes I can't predict. And often those outcomes are adverse because it's not much, as you know, John, to get in high glucose levels or low glucose levels. And I can talk about the literature extensively on this, but I don't have to. I can just tell you it's lived personal experience. You go high in blood sugar, you feel sluggish. You feel like you're carrying around extra weight around.
Sure.
And then you go low, obviously your brain's in a neurological crisis. And so it's going to do everything. It's like fight or flight response. That impairs performance too. So more normal blood sugars, the better the outcomes. And so I focus on removing the biggest challenges to normal blood sugars going into any type of performance or activity. And so, yeah, I actually fast now. I used to not do that, but now I do because it's just easier, with 2 kids and working multiple job type thing.
So what do you do? Do you fast in the morning and then after jits, and that's when you eat your first meal?
Yep.
And then, I mean, that's pretty good. I'll tell you, I kind of dig fasting. It's kind of easy in the morning. I just get up and I drink coffee, and then I'll usually kind of like, most of my training's right around noon. So I kind of like, it's not like I have to eat very late, where like people train at like 4 or 5 and then their first meal's at 6 or 7. Like I can't do that. But, if I can train around noon and then eat my first meal around 1:30, 2 o'clock, I'm usually pretty happy. Makes everything a lot easier. Great.
I will tell you the barrier, like when you say 6 or 7 o'clock at night, I will start to feel pretty thinned out. Like hydration starts to be an issue if I don't eat any food and I were to go to like 6, 7 o'clock at night and I start to do like a serious weightlifting session or otherwise. I found within type 1 diabetes, the benefit of type 1 diabetes that a lot of people don't appreciate is that you inject insulin on the outside of the body. The drawbacks are all the limitations that we already spoke about. But the positive is that you are hypersaturating the muscle and peripheral tissues with insulin at around 3 to 4 higher levels than you do, John. So John, me and you, let's say we're identical twins. I have type 1 diabetes, you don't. So the insulin I have to administer might be the exact same amount of units that your body is releasing. But because I'm injecting it from the peripheral tissues and it's going into the body, whereas yours is releasing it from the inside and it's trying to get to the outside tissues, 66 to 75% of the insulin you release is going to go to the liver and restore liver glycogen.
Sure.
The 25 to 33% is going to be used as muscle and fat. For me, John, when I actually inject insulin or anyone with type 1 diabetes, the ratio flips. So 66 to 75% of that insulin goes to the muscle and tissues like the fat tissue first. Very little gets to the liver. So there's a distinct advantage in type 1 diabetes in that most of the insulin you administer, if you're an athlete, is going to the muscle first.
Is this why guys use exogenous insulin, like the bodybuilders use it?
This is why bodybuilders will risk their life taking exogenous insulin because of the potential benefit it can in helping build muscle. It's also why a lot of mixed martial arts is one of the strategies. So this is public now, but mixed martial artists, when they drop water weight or like boxing or any of these weight-based weight categories, if they just go drink, like, let's say Gatorade afterwards, only so much of that is going to retain weight. They're only probably going to gain like 5-10 pounds max. If they were to IV infuse insulin and glucose, it models what's happening in type 1 diabetes. And so they blow up like a balloon within 24 hours. And so they can gain 20 pounds. And you can, I don't know, you can probably actually look this up online if they're actually public. Well, if some people are open about this, it's one of the fastest ways to rehydrate because they're modeling what's happening in type 1 diabetes. But in type 1 diabetes, you live this every day. So if you know what you're doing, it can be an athletic advantage, but you have to do that with an asterisk, and that you have to manage that caveat of the variability it induces, and you have to make different choices. You have different constraints. We also know this with Tour de France riders. I'm pretty sure Lance Armstrong came out publicly and stated this in one of his documentaries. They were IV infusing insulin and glucose in between every race, because it hyperhydrated them rapidly. These guys were getting off one of the most grueling biking events, and then they were doing it for a month straight.
Yeah.
So if they were basically the only way they were going to rehydrate, and honestly, it made it safer for them to IV infuse not only glucose, but insulin, because it hypersaturated most of the tissues that were active and being utilized during the activity in the periphery. And so it's a very common, either way, that's actually what happens in type 1 diabetes 24/7. And so it's a curse and an advantage, and it's depending on how much of that ratio of the advantage versus curse you make it is how you leverage your life, and some of the decisions you make around nutrition, exercise, insulin, and lifestyle strategies. Because it's certainly not a benefit for most people, but if you know what you're doing, you can turn some of that into a benefit.
So do you eat primarily low carb?
Yeah. So I primarily focus on the principle. So yes is a short answer. The long answer, or little of an answer, is that I focus on foods that allow me to normal blood sugar levels as much as possible. Only because the accumulative effect of high and variable glucose levels has effects on how I feel, and on how I perform. And obviously the chronic implications of high and variable glucose levels are well documented in type 1 diabetes and affect almost every tissue in the body. So as a result, I just want to choose meals that allow me to get normal blood sugar levels. Now, if I could eat 500 carbs in a meal and do that, I'd probably eat 500 carbs. But the reality is that carbohydrates have the most rapid and potent impact on blood sugar levels. And as a result, I try to minimize them to the point at which it allows me to get normal blood sugar levels. And then I focus mostly on protein, mostly on fat, but my carbs aren't zero. I'm not doing any of these crazy forms of the diet. I minimize the carbohydrates to what allows me to keep blood sugars as normal as possible, because I do all these things, John, but I'm a dad. I work multiple jobs, and my cognition and mood and physical activity is very high as well. And so I want to perform great at all this. I don't want to be a shit dad. I don't want to be a shit husband and be tired and have symptoms of mental health issues. That's basically what hyperglycemia or high blood sugar levels and low blood sugar levels symptoms are. If you go look them up online and Google them, they're mental health symptoms. They're all temporary based on blood sugar levels, but that's what they are. And I don't want to feel those. And so I prioritize my life around getting normal glucose levels, but I do that by focusing on nutrition that is easier and more reliably managed. So less rapid impacts on glucose levels. And if I were to incorporate more rapid forms of glucose impacting food, let's say if I were to include any carbohydrates, which I keep to a pretty low minimum, post-exercise is a great time to do that.
Sure.
Because you can intramuscular inject rapid-acting insulin. It's going to usually increases the speed post-exercise twofold. So now you're taking a 2-hour insulin to a 1-hour insulin. And then I have it with a mixed meal. And so, but I don't do a ton, because the more you give, the more insulin you give, the more uncertainty you have with that. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, do you monitor your calories pretty close, or you just kind of eat to being satiated?
I used to be fixated on it, John. I don't even pay attention anymore. I just eat what's standard. Like, hey, this is what I have for lunch. This is what I have for dinner. I might snack once in a while, not a ton, and that's it. So but when I did track it recently, I did a self-analysis of on myself over the last 17 years, and we did a publication on it. That I tracked, and I was around 3,000 calories a day, which was higher than I expected. I mean, totally honest with you, I thought I was like 2,500 at most, but I was actually pushing around 3,000 kcals, and I was eating around 49 net carbohydrates per day. So not very much compared to most people.
So you think that's 400 calories. So you'd have to go 2,600 from protein and fat. So I assume you're probably somewhere around 250 grams of protein, 1,000, probably picking up another, 2,000 or 1,500 in fat is probably the easiest way to kind of approach it.
Yep. And I was probably around 30-ish% from protein, give or take a day. And it was all backlogged. It was usually later in the day, because I don't want to have like a Thanksgiving meal for lunch every single day just to make up the calories. Because then you feel sluggish no matter what you eat. And so, yeah.
Well, I mean, muscle extremely insulin sensitive, and fat's extremely oxidative. And I think like with insulin sensitivity, I mean, like the thing I talk to my son a lot about is like, as you go forward, your ability to carry a lot of muscle is a great indicator for your health. People that cannot carry a lot of muscle, they're not, insulin sensitive, and like, and the goal is to make him as normal as possible, I guess, if you can use the word normal. But, I talked to him about that in terms of like, hey man, we know we're on the right track, and he's 9, but like, if you, are pretty fit and like you carry a lot of muscle, like that's a great indicator that we're on the right track. It's, unless you're a pro bodybuilder who's taking a bunch of drugs to, naturally be able to carry a lot of muscle is a great indicator of your health and that you're doing something right. So if you're packing up a lot of excess body fat and you look like a fucking melted candle, and I'll use the F word again, that is not good. And I'm sure any people that I've ever talked to that try to extrapolate the effects and the mechanisms for type 1 diabetes to healthy people, I land base. I carpet bomb them, because you can't. There's no way to kind of be able to kind of pull this thing out. And I'm like, dude, like you said, and you brought up a great point about the delivery system and the fact that it saturates the muscles and the liver and that. I mean, there's just very little crossover. But for a son that has it and who's had it since he's 5, to be able to kind of manage these things and constantly going through his phone and being like, okay, let's get all the, insulin off board. But then he's also a little kid and he doesn't have a huge stomach. And I think that's another one too, especially for kids, is they're a lot more emotional. Like, I can just suffer and not eat. It's not that really a big deal. If I've fasted for longer periods of time and you hungry? Yeah, it's fine. But I can just go on with my day. Whereas I know when he starts getting hungry and everything kind of starts getting in, and it's just one of those issues. But I wish it was something he did not have to tackle. But I think it's a fascinating thing, and I appreciate your help. So the point of this podcast is I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the information that you're going to push out and the fact that you're trying to challenge one of the most sacred cows in sports nutrition, the idea that carbohydrates are essential for performance. And I wanted to get into why you started questioning this model, and more importantly, the information that you found.
Well, for a long time, when you think about nutrition, everyone hears about, hey, you need a carb load or muscle glycogen, or all these sports nutrition drinks or foods like gels and Gatorades. All these other things are very carb heavy. And so where did that come from? Well, because that helps understand why we are where we are with the sports nutrition guidelines, and then what we actually ended up discovering recently that I think upends a lot of our expectations or realities around sports nutrition. And back in the 1800s in the Olympics, all the way up to the 1960s, the vast majority of Olympians were consuming a fat and protein predominant diet, consuming absorbent amount of protein. I mean, very, very high levels of protein, and they weren't really focused on carbohydrates. But in the 1960s,
where does that information come from? Is it just historical information that the majority of food they ate was probably some form of animal-based proteins?
So they actually have logs of this, and there's actually some publications that have historically looked back on some of those historical logs and athletes and what their typical dietary regimens are. And so a lot of teams were cafeteria based. So a lot of athletes would go what would be in those cafeteria based environments, what were the foods provided, things along those lines. It was very, very protein centric.
So give me an example of a standard meal. So for the listeners at home.
Yeah. So they would be consuming, let's say you had pork in the form of lamb chops. They would be consuming those at very high volumes. They would also have vegetables, and they weren't necessarily low carb, by the way. This is a note. They were just protein and fat centric. So lamb chops are not low in fat. Yeah. They're very high in fat, and they would eat very high quantities of those. They would also be consuming other foods alongside that in the form of vegetables. They may have some potatoes. They may have some form of bread with those. So it was more of more like a Western diet, actually. But they were more focused on the protein, more focused on the fat in total volume. Most of the calories came from that. Where it's interesting, as time started transition in the 1960s, there was a physician named Bergstrom, and he actually developed something called the Bergstrom muscle biopsy technique, where they actually stuck a metal needle into the muscle and pulled tissue out. And then they were able to actually analyze the muscle tissue and found that, oh, wow, they're actually storing glucose in the muscle in the form of these glucose chains called glycogen. And so clearly, if they're storing it as glycogen, it must be essential for performance. And that shifted the tides and the guidelines at that point to more carbohydrate-centric based analysis, because they also showed that as glycogen levels got low, athletes would start to hit fatigue earlier. So then we shift to the 1980s, where they started developing these unique techniques where people would put a mask on an athlete and analyze the amount of oxygen consumed and the amount of carbon dioxide that they would breathe out. And the ratio of the volume of oxygen to carbon dioxide would predict the amount of fat or carbohydrates they were burning. And what they found is that athletes who consumed a lot of carbohydrates would burn more carbohydrates, a little bit of a no-brainer. But in doing so, they also found an association between those who burned more carbohydrates had lower onset of fatigue, meaning they were able to go longer during exercise. But again, just an association. They were just finding associations between carbohydrate oxidation and glycogen with performance. Now, we then get to the 1990s where they developed this model from all this information gathered, these association studies, that, hey, look, we're starting to see using these techniques that when athletes start to get to higher and higher intensities, they almost require carbohydrates. It's something called a crossover concept, that as the exercise activity gets higher, the dependence on carbohydrates become much higher and fat becomes much lower. Whereas if you're around 85% of your total maximal aerobic power and maintaining that, the amount of fat being utilized would be theoretically close to zero, and the amount of carbohydrates would be theoretically close to 100%. Now, these are all hypothetical. You're always using all the nutrients your body allows, just at different proportions based on the activity. But then we transitioned to a number of studies in the early 2020, where they did these short duration studies where they had athletes for less than 3 weeks in duration consume low carb diets. And what they found is that these athletes were elite athletes. We're seeing these marginal impairments in performance, like 2%. So, for most people, that's doesn't matter to them. They never notice the difference.
Sure.
But for an elite athlete, that might be first or second place. And so that got a lot of headlines. And so we left with these guidelines that athletes should be consuming somewhere between 5 and 12 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram per day, and on top of that, during intense activity, they should be consuming 60 to 120 grams per hour. So this was pushing some athletes, particularly on the high end, upwards of over 1,000 calories per day, as the current recommendations from the ACSM, the American Dietetics Association, Canadian Dietetics Association, ISSN, all these other organizations all recommend these similar protocols. Now, what we were interested in is we said, okay, well, that's very interesting, but one of the biggest caveats in all these studies, John, is that they were all, the ones that looked at these lower carbohydrate-based studies, they were very short in duration. And back in the 1980s, a prominent physician named Stephen Phinney had done some exercise studies, and I spoke to him in person about this. And he said, when I was testing these athletes going on these ketogenic diets or low-carb diets, when they first started the diet, he was racing with these cyclists. So he was a researcher, but also a cyclist himself. He would be racing alongside them. And then once they started the diet, he's like, man, I would blow past them. But then around week 3 and week 4, they would blow past me again. He's like, there's something fascinating about the adaptation that took not just one day or 1 week. It was taking over 3 weeks to adapt to these athletes. But once they did, they started to see no impairment in their performance. And so I thought, okay, this is very interesting. A lot of these prior studies had major confounders. Let's actually test this. The assumption here, John, is that if you do these short duration, high intensity bouts of exercise, let's say 6 by 800 meter sprints, or you run the fastest 1 mile you ever can in your life, that's going to be very, very intense. And as a result, in theory, based on all this prior evidence and assumptions made in the scientific community in sports nutrition, would be requiring carbohydrates to perform. Well, we tested that. We actually had athletes go on a ketogenic diet for 4 weeks. So these were runners who were competitive runners who were running at least 50 kilometers per week as a minimum, high VO2 maxes, low body weight, very fit. And we asked them to run their fastest 1 mile time trial and 6 by 800 meter sprints. And what we found is that when they did both forms of the diet in a randomized fashion, we controlled all these variables that many other studies didn't. We were able to find that these athletes showed no impairment in performance when running or actually doing a randomized controlled trial with sufficient time on the diet. Now, that totally upended the expectation that the sports guidelines state, because in theory, you need 400 to 1,000 grams of carbohydrates if you're a high-end athlete performing any form of a decent amount of exercise per day. But these athletes were consuming less than 50 grams per day and performing the exact same as they were when they were consuming well over 300 grams of carbohydrates per day. And so what was fascinating about that is that we also saw that 30% of these athletes had glucose levels on the high carb diet consistent with prediabetes. So these athletes were fit, running frequently, high VO2 maxes, low body fat, but yet had glucose levels consistent with prediabetes on the high carb diet, which completely resolved when they went on the low carbohydrate diet. So not only did it show, hey, if you actually test the theory, you actually don't just make the assumptions that were drawn about due to associations, But you actually test the theory, John, in its real setting, you find, oh, wait, there isn't any difference with low carb versus high carb if you adapt long enough, but there might actually be a consequence to athletes pushing extremely high levels of carbohydrates per day. And we did the same thing because the feedback from that study was, well, that's short duration. You need to do long duration because athletes, there's no way they're going to perform optimally if they do long duration. And so we recruited Ironman athletes, Ironman competitors, had them hit the wall, go for 2 to 4 hours duration exercise until they reach something called hypoglycemia on a high and low carb diet, actually achieve ketosis and ketogenic diet. And again, on the ketogenic diet, low carb diet, they saw no deterioration in performance yet again, as long as they were able to adapt the diet for long enough. Now, John, one important point about this, though, is you mentioned a study that we were doing. Those are studies that have already been published. But what we just did is, because of those studies, emerged this thought of how did we get to the point where everyone is believing they need to push 60 to 120 grams per hour of carbohydrates while they're doing exercise, or consuming 400 to over 1,000 calories, over 400 to 1,000 grams of carbohydrates per hour while doing exercise. Like, why, where did that come from? And so we reviewed over 100 years of evidence, over 600 citations, and conducted multiple meta-analysis in this publication that is now going to be released in Endocrine Reviews, which shows that when looking across all these studies, when athletes just consume higher and higher levels of carbohydrates, all they do, John, is shift the amount of fuel they're burning from fat just shrinks, and it's shifted and supplemented for carbohydrates. The amount of actual energetic output is the same, but they're just shifting where it's coming from.
Sure.
In fact, then the last piece here, John, that's ironic is that when you consume high carbohydrates, it spikes insulin. And so a lot of athletes think, I'm going to consume carbohydrates during my exercise to prevent glycogen from being broken down. But what actually happens paradoxically is when insulin is spiked because of high carbohydrates, insulin binds to the fat cell with such high affinity, it prevents fat from being broken down and utilized as a fuel source. And so you actually block fat oxidation. And so the body paradoxically accelerates glycogen breakdown. And so a lot of these theories as to why people need 600 to 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour, or they need to consume 400 to 1,000 grams of kcals per hour, was based on science that was largely in association. And when you actually look at over 100 years of evidence, we see that these theories pushing super high loads of carbohydrates do not, one, appear necessary, but two, actually may have health consequences in some athletes.
So all they're doing is they're just keeping the calories constant. They're just supplementing out because, I mean, it's very hard to eat both a high carb and a high fat diet.
Exactly.
Yeah. And if you do, it's usually like, I always call fat and carbs are like the Bermuda Triangle. I mean, you think about donuts. I mean, that's the reason that most people are obese is because, fat and carbohydrate. You mentioned that the 100 years of data, including like multiple meta-analysis, like point to this like misguided overemphasis on glycogen. Why do you think it's persisted so long, like within the research and the marketing?
That's a great question. And I have to speculate that, well, look, if you consume, so there is evidence that if you consume carbohydrates, you perform better. But then that led to this overemphasis. Okay, well, if you perform better with some, you should have more.
Yeah.
You should have more. Because what was happening is that, if you consume like even a little bit of carbohydrates, we've shown in studies on a ketogenic diet that even giving just 1 tablespoon of carbohydrate per hour, so equivalent to 10 grams per hour, you improve performance on ketogenic diets or high carb diets if the bout of exercise is long enough. But do you need 60 to 120 grams per hour? That's where I think a lot of these prior analysis that were showing associations between the amount of glycogen and carbohydrate oxidation, and their association, not causal effect, but association on performance, led people to think, oh, wow, that muscle glucose sink in the muscle is huge. The amount of carbohydrates your whole body is burning is huge. So the only way to perform better, if those are the predictors of performance, we need to load the body with tons of carbohydrates. When in reality, what we found with this review is that the maintenance of blood sugar levels, more specifically, John, the maintenance of brain energetic needs, was actually the primary predictor of performance across most of these studies. because almost all the studies I referenced before where they showed glycogen levels being low or low carbohydrate oxidation leading to early fatigue, the same studies also looked at blood sugar levels and found that the major confounder in all the studies is that blood sugar levels usually would get into hypoglycemic levels during exercise. And so in the absence of carbohydrate, when you're exercising for over 2 hours in duration, athletes were getting drops in blood sugars that would lead them into clinical hypoglycemia. And as you know very well, John, as someone who lives very closely with someone with type 1 diabetes, if you go into clinical hypoglycemia, you will impair performance. There's not a question of if, you will impair your performance. And so even just a little bit of glucose to maintain the smaller glucose pool, the blood, instead of these massive glucose pools, the muscle and the total body amount of carbohydrates being oxidized is what we found being the primary determinant of exercise when we looked at 100 years of evidence. And so it shifts the thinking away from needing truckloads of carbohydrates to just needing prescriptive amounts that align with the ability to maintain glucose levels.
Dude, I mean, it almost makes sense to just earn your carbs, not just indiscriminately just smash them. All right. So can you, let's get a little deeper into this idea of like brain energy. Like that was one of the things as you sent me over the research, like the concept of like brain energy as a true performance limiter. How does glucose, ketones, and all those kind of shift within fatigue and bonking? Because I mean, you brought up a great point. Like I see that in my son. Like I know when he gets into that like hypo and even like blood sugar drops. I mean, if he gets high, I can see it in his face, and if he gets low. So that idea of like brain energy and how that kind of lines up.
So when we've known since the 1920s that athletes who go into low levels of glucose level, they go into the brain goes into an energy deficit. The brain was once thought to be 100% reliant on glucose. We now know that it can be fueled by ketones and lactate. Yeah. In fact, ketones and lactate appear to be a preferential fuel for the brain because the more ketones and lactate are present in the blood, the brain will uptake and utilize them first. And that makes sense, John, because when you think about the total brain energy pool, it's not just glucose. It's glucose plus ketones plus lactate. Yeah. It's all three of these combined. And so when there have been studies back in the 1960s where people went on a fast for 30 days and injected insulin in a clinical lab setting. It was an experimental setting that you could never repeat nowadays. Yeah. And they would get into levels of hypoglycemia that would cause seizures or coma. And the ketone levels were so high that they were asymptomatic, meaning they had no symptoms of hypoglycemia. Well, why would that be? Because their brain energy was being sufficiently fueled by the amount of ketones that was supplementing any need for glucose in the brain. Now, the question to brain energy deficits. So think about this. So for the average listener, they may be thinking like, oh, how does that work? Well, just think about this. The brain is one of the most important dictators of performance. Yes, physical attributes like muscle mass, function, all these other things are important, but one of the best ways to improve performance is to simply believe you will perform better, meaning that psychological changes in your brain can improve performance. Well, we also know that biological changes in the brain also have a top-down approach. They also affect performance. You know, it makes total sense, right? The brain is one of the central governors of not only how your body works, but also how it performs. And so if your brain is not sufficiently fueled and it believes it's in a crisis, then it is likely going to try to tell your body to shut down, to stop, right? And so that's what hypoglycemia is often doing in these athletes when blood glucose gets so low. It's alerting them that their glucose levels are so sufficiently low that it's actually leading them to compromise the most important tissue in your entire body, your brain. And so then it causes your body to start shutting down. And as a result, causes your body to not be able to perform physically. It's actually survival, more so than anything. But your brain has multiple metabolites it can use, which is why when athletes shift from, let's say, like a high carb diet to a ketogenic diet, where ketone bodies are elevated, and lactate actually also is an important factor, that also can offset the amount of glucose required in the blood to maintain performance. This is why the emergence of things like exogenous ketones have come on board. We've tested those in a number of settings before, and why we see most predictably over 100 years of evidence that when the most common time carbohydrates improve performance, John, was when the control group had a drop in blood glucose levels. What does that mean? That means when experimentally people were showing in the scientific studies that carbohydrates improve performance, it was almost universally when the other group saw a drop in glucose levels. So that meant that administering carbohydrates was improving performance most reliably by just maintaining or elevating glucose levels. As a result, that leads us to realize that it doesn't require much glucose to maintain blood glucose levels. There's about 1 tablespoon, no, I forget the exact amount, very little amounts of glucose floating around your blood, like very small amounts are floating around your blood. It doesn't take much to maintain those levels. So, but if you had to constantly push carbohydrates to maintain all the glucose your muscles can store and all the glucose your body can break down, well then, yeah, you'd have to push high volumes of carbohydrates, which is why we got to this theory that you needed truckloads of carbohydrates. But now we see there's actually potentially consequences to this in athletes. As one example, there's I texted you about this. There's a guy named Lionel Sanders who was a world champion Ironman triathlete who went on to get, he was consuming over 1,000 carbohydrates per day, went on to publicly disclose that he was feeling tired, had sleep issues, it wasn't recovering well, got a blood test, everything was fine except he had prediabetes. And then he cut out all these very high glycemic.
Pre-diabetes really a thing?
It definitely is.
I kind of thought it's like being pregnant. Like you either are diabetic or you're not. Like, I mean, the numbers are. So
okay,
like,
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, like whenever I hear these people be like, I'm pre-diabetic, I'm like, it's kind of like being pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. I don't know if there's pre-diabetic or diabetic.
So that's a really, to break down a little bit further. So when people become just obese, so they start to build adipose tissue, more adipose tissue than their body should carry, their insulin levels rise, sometimes double. As they progress in their form of obesity, more adipose tissue, they can get up to 6-fold higher insulin levels than normal. Insulin sensitivity would drop initially 33%, and then they start to drop 75, 80%. Wow. And so the more adipose tissue accumulates, the more insulin progressively becomes resistant. This is a progressive change over time. But that progression leads into diagnostic categories. And those diagnostic categories are things like obesity, then prediabetes, then type 2 diabetes. But the reality is that it's a spectrum, right? Just like there's a spectrum of athleticism, there's a spectrum of many different things, but it really is a continuum that as you get higher and higher, the more adipose tissue you carry, the worse and worse it gets. The more blood sugar levels rises, the worse and worse it gets. So I actually view it as a non-categorical continuum from healthy to progressively worse.
Would you say obesity is probably the number one cause for it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a chicken or an egg thing. Like, do you get obese because of it, or is it obesity causes it? It's probably a confounding deal. Like, low energy expenditure, overconsumption of calories. Now, all of a sudden, like this cascading effect happens, and next thing you know, you're in the shit.
Yep. Yeah, and then people wonder why 95% of Americans in the United States of America today have some biomarker in their blood that indicates their metabolism has some type of derangement, whether it be high triglyceride levels, high blood sugar levels, hell, their waistline is elevating. 93% of Americans have at least one biomarker that indicates that they're on the wrong trajectory and their metabolism is becoming progressively more deranged. We know that new analysis looking at the United States of America, when you actually look at not just obesity as the amount of weight you carry per height, but also symptoms, biological changes, tissue damage. If you look at all three of those together, we see that up to 68% of Americans actually have some form of obesity. And so without a doubt, obesity is one of the earliest and most common universal initiators of many of these chronic diseases. How diabetes has gone up 500% over the last four decades. We know that cardiovascular disease affects over half of adults. We know that that a fourth of all adults are diagnosed with some major mental health issue, and the numbers of adults on some type of psychoactive medication nowadays is also astronomically high. I mean, almost every major chronic disease is on the up. Almost none of them are on their way down. And unfortunately, it's because we're becoming progressively unhealthy. And I would argue that the diet is the primary reason for that.
Could it be a combination of diet and also environmental factors? I recently had a conversation with Tom Incledon, who's out at Cosenta out in Arizona, who he's basically running a massive cancer research facility now. And he's like, you can get into some of the genetic stuff, but he goes, 85% of the cancers that I'm encountering are environmental. And he goes, we've never seen an uptick of cancer for people under the age of 30 as we are recently. And he goes, under the age of 40, I mean, it's unprecedented. And he believes it's from the food is not nearly as nutrient dense as it once was. And the environmental factors and the pollutants and all this that are within the food that people are consuming and just the environment we're living in has never been more toxic. So I wonder if these are just the effects of it. And then, that's another interesting one too, where all of a sudden people store all this fat, and then as they start kind of leaning out and losing that fat, they, that all of a sudden gets released in the body, can cause more and more troubles. As I was going through the notes, there was a pretty interesting one where there's kind of a misconception that ketogenic athletes are immune to bonking. That if you are in a keto state, but can you refute that, or has it been observed, or are there contradictions within that assumption? But I thought that was a pretty interesting.
They 100% can bonk, John. Yeah. So there was a long belief that there was a big push some time ago that, hey, look, if you're on a ketogenic diet
and you're totally fat adapted. The idea of that
totally fat adapted, that in theory you will be able to tap into an unlimited source of fuel forever. When in reality, we actually tested this. We had athletes adapt to the diet for over 6 weeks, Ironman competitors do the ketogenic diet, and they did bonk. They bonked just like they bonked on the high carb diet, and actually at the same exact rate they bonked. The reality is that because blood glucose levels was the primary determinant of exercise performance, and not only that study, but the major analysis we did over the last 100 years, blood glucose levels will eventually come down. They will eventually come down if you don't provide any fuel substrate during that exercise bout. And as a result, they will bonk. But what actually benefits ketogenic athletes is actually a little bit of carbohydrates, just like high carbohydrate athletes. A little bit of carbohydrates appears to have a profound effect on maintaining glucose levels and then improving performance. This is actually one of the biggest errors that ketogenic athletes make, is they think that when they want peak performance, if you run or race or doing whatever, you probably don't need anything. But if you're doing a performance-based bout where you really want peak performance, we see that providing just even a little bit of carbohydrates, like 1 tablespoon per hour, is sufficient to improve performance 22% on not just a high carb diet, but also a ketogenic diet. And without it, they bonked again 22% sooner. So yes, they can definitely bonk, John. And actually, ironically, a little bit of carbohydrates actually can benefit them, at least in prolonged, intense, strenuous forms of exercise.
So would you want your athletes to be fat adapted, ideally, than rather than, we used to call them sugar burners. And I remember this one when we owned a gym, I could almost smell it on people's breath. Like I could tell, it's like they were telling me about what they ate, and I could smell this almost like burning trash smell in their mouth. And I went through this pretty extensively, and I'm like, man, I think you eat way too many carbohydrates. Like my favorite one is, I'm hypoglycemic. I'm like, no, that's just code for you eat too many carbohydrates. Unless you're type 1 diabetic, you're not really hypoglycemic. For a healthy individual, that's not a real thing.
This is a very controversial area, but I would argue that if you wanted to tap into more diverse fuels or be quote unquote more metabolically flexible, that a ketogenic diet is a better representation of that than a high carbohydrate diet is. If you look at high carbohydrate based athletes, they burn such a disproportionate level of their fuel from carbohydrates, whereas ketogenic athletes actually burn about a 50-50 split of fat and carbohydrates at the same time. So in theory, you're more flexible, more metabolically flexible, but the reality is that the performance output, as long as they're both consuming a healthy form of each of these diets and they adapt to it for long enough, is equivalent. The question is, what's the consequences outside of the performance setting? What's the health consequences? Because if it doesn't change performance and you can perform the same on either diet, then the choice isn't about performance anymore. Then it's about health. How do you feel? And other factors, which unfortunately the vast majority of Americans are pretty unhealthy.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of dancing around two different individuals, right? You're talking about high-performing individuals and the average American. So like that's where I think this thing gets a little confusing, where you're like, let's say you're talking about a high-performance individual who, is probably pretty lean, training with great intensity, I mean, it's kind of fascinating to look at that and be like, hey, even for these high-performance individuals that probably carry a lot of muscle, pretty lean, super fit, doing all this different training with a high carbohydrate diet, are putting themselves into a, I know, dude, that's a tongue twister. High carbohydrate diet, are putting themselves into a, pre-diabetic state. But for the average American who's not a high performance individual, that probably doesn't do daily exercise, that probably is sleeping by shit, like consuming energy drinks and, too much screen time and, a myriad of other issues that, we won't get into. For those individuals, a high carbohydrate diet is probably a death sentence.
I would contend that it's very extremely more risky for the average American. And the reason I say that is because as the average American is obese and they have their elevated levels of insulin and insulin resistance, the more glucose you put into the system with insulin resistance is only going to exaggerate that problem, right? You're only going to need the most potent form of nutrient in the diet that increases insulin levels is carbohydrates.
Sure.
So if you push higher and higher levels of that, of course, you're going to need more and more insulin. If you already have insulin resistance, and that insulin resistance and total insulin load is kind of this bidirectional amplification. The more insulin resistance, the more insulin you need. And then you add nutrients on top of it that require even more insulin. You're going to add gasoline to the fire. And so, yes, when a lot of people look at athletes and say, oh, look, they're consuming all these carbohydrates per hour. Number one, they probably don't even need to do that. But number two, they're in a totally different category. Whereas, the elite athletes are 0.0001% of the population.
Sure.
And then at the general, person is looking at these elite athletes and saying, well, I should do that too. When in reality, no, you should not. You should definitely not do that. Don't do that, actually. So
one of the things, and maybe you've researched this or you haven't, when the Brazilian kids that I was working with, when they, they're all from kind of northern Brazil, which is around the equator, they eat a very, very high carbohydrate diet, like a lot of beans and rice, yuca and fruit and this. And kind of when we figured it out, it was somewhere between 500 and 600 grams of carbohydrates a day on average. And when they come here to the United States, as they tried to eat their typical diet, they ended up putting on body fat. And one of the things we did is testing, and they were low in vitamin D. And so we started supplementing with vitamin D, and there was some really fascinating research talking about vitamin D levels and your ability to process carbohydrates. So we actually had to lower their carbohydrate and get them into a more balanced diet, and then they all kind of cleaned up a little bit. But their question is like, why, when I go back to Brazil, can I stay pretty lean eating this high carbohydrate diet? And I was like, well, one, you have more sun exposure. You're outside. You guys don't have air conditioning. You tend to, not sit around and watch TV and indoors, and there's just other factors. And maybe the quality of the food is different. Even though it's a less developed country, I don't know if anybody would ever think that a developed country would have a worse food source, but I think there's a pretty honest case to make that for that now. So that was a pretty interesting one with vitamin D levels. But, you think, those guys were exposed to so much, but there's an interesting kind of pathway with that. For athletes living with metabolic conditions like type 1 diabetics or even undiagnosed type 1 diabetics, or pre-diabetics, whatever, like what are the dangers with the standard high carb recommendation? Because I know from my own experience, when we were in the hospital with my son, we had to go to this little training course, and they were recommending that he have 50 grams of carbohydrate per meal, and they recommended 3 to 4 meals a day. And as we were kind of going through, and I think I've told you this, is we were kind of going through the exchanges of how they kind of look at carbohydrates and kind of dose with insulin. My question is protein has an insulinogenic effect. You guys aren't counting protein? No, it's just carbs. So he's got to have minimum 50 grams of carbohydrates. And I told the guy, I'm like, I don't probably eat 200 grams of carbohydrates in a day. You're going to recommend that a 5-year-old have 200 grams of carbohydrates? And then actually, ironically, Kate is actually at Dr. Ponder's right now, his endocrinologist. But last time I went with Kate, a lady came in with her child in a wagon because the kid was so heavy that he couldn't walk.
Hey, sorry, I forgot I have to go pick up my wife now.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Well,
he came in, so we're going to be late for jiu-jitsu. You got to go get mom. I was like, oh, shit.
Yeah. Well,
that's totally my fault because I was BSing the whole intro here.
Well, no, it was great. I'm glad we got to dig into this stuff. All right, so the research is coming out. We'll post a link. And yeah, man, I understand family and kids and jits. And so, dude, thanks for taking time to jump on Power Athlete Radio. Hopefully we can get a reboot here in the future.
Hey, John, you're the man. I truly appreciate it. And one day I will get to roll. I'm pumped about that.
I need to start training. If you're training 6 or 7, I'm going to have to up the dosage.
It might help. But I think I need the help, not you.
Yeah. All right, man. Be safe. See ya.
All right. I appreciate it, brother.
Good. This episode of Power Athlete Radio is powered by Train Heroic. the most immersive strength training app experience on the market. We've built an online training business by partnering with Train Heroic to deliver all of our world-class training programs like Jack Street, Hammer, Field Strong, and Grindstone. To learn which Power Athlete training program best suits your goals, head to powerathletehq.com/training. And if you're a coach looking to build a business with the best training tech in the business, head to trainheroic.com/powerathletehq. And now back to the show. Hey there, Power Athlete Nation. Big shout out to all the heavy hitters who stuck around till the final whistle. If you've been soaking in the knowledge bombs and epic tales we've been dropping for free, here's your chance to be a game changer. Swing by ko-fi.com/powerathlete and toss a few bucks our way to keep the podcast fueled and firing on all cylinders. That's ko-fi.com/powerathlete. Your support makes a difference. See ya.